boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, the London press conference was held today for the upcoming Taylor versus Serrano Mega Showdown, biggest fight in women's boxing. And at the press conference, Amanda Serrano issued a challenge to Katie Taylor so that their fight could be fought over 12 rounds,
3 minutes apiece.
which is pretty strange because the fight is all but done. This isn't the kind of thing you spring on your opponent. This is something that would have been negotiated when they first met in order to get the fight over the line. At this time, the official announcement has been made. The official location has been chosen.
Isn't that the kind of thing you negotiate beforehand?
I would think so. I would think that if the Amanda Serrano people wanted this fight to be fought over 12 3-minute rounds, I would have thought they would have negotiated for that in the very beginning, before the fight was officially announced. As it stands, seems a lot like Amanda sprung this on Katie Taylor at this press conference because she didn't mention it in the last one that was held in New York.
He's rocking the boat again.
That's what she's doing. I've followed Amanda Serrano's career closely over the years. She herself has never been a big proponent, a big advocate of the 3-minute round. When asked, she's actually said the opposite. She's said she doesn't need 3 minutes to knock a girl out. She's got 30 knockouts.
She said she don't need the extra minute. She's happy with 2-minute rounds.
And she's said this more than once to interviewers, on her own social media. She's never been one of the girls out there beating a drum for 3-minute rounds in women's boxing. Now she's fighting Katie Taylor. All of a sudden, she wants an additional minute.
In her own words, she's the wrong person to ask.
A little over a month ago, that's what she said. That's what she had to say about it when asked. She's the wrong person to ask about a 3-minute round because she doesn't need 3 minutes to knock a girl out, and she's happy with 2-minute rounds.
But now that she's fighting Katie, she wants 3 minutes.
And I reiterate, she's rocking the boat. That's what she's doing, because this is the kind of thing you negotiate beforehand. This is not the kind of thing you spring on your opponent at a press conference for a fight that's already done.
I hope this demand doesn't jeopardize the fight.
You never really know. The fight was all but done the last time. In 2020, the fight was all but done when Amanda Serrano decided to walk away from it because all of a sudden she didn't like the circumstances, didn't like the situation, and didn't like the money.
She said there was a pay cut when there was no pay cut.
I believe it was Jordan Maldonado that said they didn't want to have to fight in Eddie Hearn's lawn.
Because that's where they were holding fight camp at that time during the shutdown.
They wanted more money, and they wanted more time. More time for the fight's value to grow, more time for the fight to build. And now, over a year later, they're now getting more money than they would have got then, though Amanda, she still seems to want more time.
It's shameless is what it is.
I'm not as forgiving of Amanda Serrano as some others. I don't overlook this kind of stuff the way some other folks do. You've never been a proponent of the 3-minute round, but all of a sudden you're fighting Katie Taylor, now you want 3 minutes.
In the past, you've said that you don't need 3 minutes to knock a girl out.
But now that Jamie Mercado, a bantamweight that you fought up there at featherweight, and Miriam Gutierrez, who you just fought in your last fight at lightweight, now that they've gone the distance with you, and now that you're fighting Katie Taylor, all of a sudden you're a proponent, a big proponent of the 3-minute round, which wouldn't even be the worst thing in the world if you would have negotiated that beforehand, because this is not the kind of thing you spring on your opponent at a press conference.
Doesn't sound like she negotiated for it beforehand.
Amanda probably thought that because she's issuing out this challenge publicly, that she'd be putting Katie Taylor on the spot, but it doesn't help Amanda's plight that her previous comments from not that long ago, and I'm not talking about months, I'm talking about a little over a month ago, she was asked about a 3-minute round, and she says she doesn't need it. So why do you need it now?
Because Katie Taylor's a harder target than anybody she's fought before.
And underneath it all, Amanda knows that. Amanda knows that Katie Taylor's been in there with strong punchers like Rose Vellante of Brazil, 2 times against Delphine Persoon, against Christina Lenarditu up there at 140 pounds. Katie Taylor isn't in unfamiliar territory, facing a southpaw or a strong puncher. She's faced
Natasha Jonas is a hard-punching southpaw.
She fought her just last year. The real reason that Amanda Serrano is asking for 12 3-minute rounds isn't because of the scale of the fight or the occasion. It's because she wants more time in hopes that Katie will tire as the fight progresses.
Amanda Serrano's a strong puncher, but she has to accumulate damage.
She has to be able to deliver that power. She has to be able to land. And in the early goings of this fight, it's conceivable that Katie, while she's fresh, could start off with an early lead, sweep those rounds in the first half while she's fresh.
She wants more time because she's hoping that Katie gets tired.
Katie's a harder target than Jamie Mercado, a bantamweight who moved up to fight Amanda at featherweight, moved up from 122 to 126, and Amanda couldn't knock her out. More recently, Amanda faced Miriam Gutierrez, a common opponent between her and Katie, nowhere near as hard a target. Amanda landed a lot of hard shots, but she couldn't get her out of there either. So what she's hoping for with Katie is that They can add more time to the fight so that Katie will tire as the fight progresses. Though I reiterate, that's not the kind of thing you spring on your opponent. That's the kind of thing you negotiate beforehand. And the fact that she didn't mention it in New York at the kickoff press conference for this thing, that she's springing it on Katie now in London.
She's nervous.
You know, I've been watching these press conferences, and if you want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, Amanda Serrano's been giving away certain tells that she is uneasy when faced with Katie Taylor, face to face. She's fidgety, can't stop moving, can't stop smiling. Her knives are getting the better of her.
The fight is done. What do you want to do now? Renegotiate the terms?
Fight's supposed to be done, ain't it? It's been officially announced. It's got an official date, an official venue.
This is the second press conference you're doing for the fight, but this is the first time you're mentioning this.
She didn't ask for 12 3-minute rounds in 2020. She hasn't ever been an advocate of the 3-minute round in women's boxing, let alone 12 3-minute rounds. So where do you come from with this stuff?
It's knives. Her knives are getting the better of her.
It's not as simple as saying that she's feeling the tension that a fighter might feel before a big fight. No, this is more akin to the walls closing in on her. She's unsure of her power against a harder target than any target she's ever had to face before. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Billy Joe Saunders really wants a rematch with Chris Eubank Jr., according to boxers Ben Shalom, who said he's spoken to Billy Joe Saunders recently and expects him to fight again. He added that Kell Brock could move up and fight Eubank Jr. if he beats Amir Khan on February 19th.
Yeah, but don't Khan versus Brook got a two-way rematch clause?
Depending on the aesthetic of that match, how it wears on the fighters, and the fight's outcome, you have to question as to whether or not the winner of that fight will be willing to move up and face Chris Eubank Jr., as they'd be facing certain peril at a higher weight. And if that Khan versus Brook fight is commercially successful, they might want to run it back. They might want to do it again. When it comes to Billy Joe Saunders on Chris Eubank Jr.'s unanimous decision win over Liam Williams, when Eubank can outbox somebody, that's when you know you've had a bad night. His boxing ability's like a baby giraffe. That's just been born. It was terrible.
I don't expect Billy Joe Saunders to have very many nice things to say about Chris.
Those two boys have been trading bobs for years. Ever since Billy Joe Saunders gave Chris Eubank Jr. his first professional loss, they've been going at it back and forth. Thus, I don't expect Billy to have very many nice things to say about Chris. This isn't even the first we've heard of a potential rematch between them. We've talked about it here on the channel. Billy Joe Saunders on a potential Chris Eubank Jr. rematch. Do I think I can do the weight comfortably? It doesn't matter if I can do it comfortably or not with him. I could do it half dead and still beat him, because Chris is campaigning as a middleweight, whereas Billy Joe Saunders has since moved up to super middleweight. He was a champion there for a while, and in his last fight, Canelo Alvarez stopped him, took his belt.
You know, I heard Billy Joe wants £5 million for that fight.
Something like that. When it comes to this potential matchup, this potential rematch, you do have to question how much money is it going to take to get Billy Joe Saunders in the ring with Chris Eubank Jr.
How much exactly?
Because I don't get the sense that he'll give Chris the satisfaction on the cheap. I don't get the sense that Billy Joe Saunders is going to fight him for just any amount of money, and that creates a problem. Sky needs familiar faces to put together familiar fights.
Billy might price himself out of that thing.
You think he won't? He just scored a multi-million-dollar payday with Canelo Alvarez in his last fight. What's he going to want for a Chris Eubank Jr. rematch? It's a sensible fight, a sensical fight, but it's a fight that has obstacles. It's a fight that has problems. What's Billy going to want for the fight? And is Sky and Boxer, are they going to be willing to pay the piper? And at what weight will the fight be staged? Will it be a middleweight contest or a super middleweight contest? Will they do it at a catch weight? Because I don't actually believe Billy can make 160 pounds anymore.
Billy Joe Saunders is still a trickier guy than anybody Chris Eubank Jr. has beat.
Chris Eubank Jr. beat a very past-it James DeGale, who surrendered his IBF title to Jose Uzcategui so he can go have a money fight with Chris. And, you know, Chris, he did beat that guy, but we all know that
he was shot.
James DeGale was shot by the time those two guys fought. Avni Yildirim, he did knock out Avni Yildirim, but in the greater scheme of things...
Well, because Billy Joe Saunders isn't as tricky as Avni Yildirim.
This is a good fight if the fight can be made, if they can get it over the line. Though I reiterate, it's a fight that has problems. Weight problems, money problems.
Yeah, Chris Eubank Jr. versus Liam Williams did great numbers.
Just a little over 1 million people tuned into that fight. Now that fight over there in the United Kingdom was not a pay-per-view. It was on regular Sky, not Sky Box Office. But those are still very encouraging numbers. Sky continues to be a formidable adversary for Eddie Hearn now that they have parted ways. And it's conceivable that Sky might be willing to spend...
How much is the question? How much would it take to get Billy in the ring with Chris again?
I just told you, I vaguely recall hearing that he wants something like £5 million, which translates to about $6-7 million. That's not a $6-7 million fight, unfortunately.
Not even a title on the line.
Hypothetically speaking, let's say you give Billy Joe Saunders 3, 4, maybe even £5 million. What are you going to give Chris? And where's that going to put the value of the fight? If you give Billy Joe Saunders 5 and you give Chris 5 or you give Chris 4, this is a $9-10 million fight?
What is Sky willing to put up to get Billy in the ring with Chris?
Billy Joe Saunders hasn't officially retired, you know. He hasn't called it a career yet. It's conceivable that he may fight again. But in order to give Chris Eubank Jr. the satisfaction, he's likely going to want a big bag. And it really is a question of how big does the bag have to be? And is it bigger than Sky is willing to pay out?
In order for this rematch to materialize, Billy Joe Saunders has to be realistic.
I think that Sky is willing to pay and pay handsomely, though perhaps not quite as handsome as Billy Joe Saunders would like in order to give Chris Eubank Jr. the satisfaction. Though at the same time, Billy Joe Saunders, he's not a champion anymore. He doesn't have a belt. He's coming off a loss. What does he expect?
You're expecting money in the neighborhood of what you just made with Canelo Alvarez to fight Chris Eubank.
It's going to take some gimme from both sides in order to get this fight, this rematch, over the line. And if I'm being honest, Chris Eubank Jr. needs it, but so does Billy Joe Saunders, because what is left for him? It's not likely he gets a rematch with Canelo Alvarez. I don't know what his promotional situation is, though I get the sense that because he's talking to Ben Shalom, he may not be with Matchroom anymore.
Both teams are going to have to be very realistic for this rematch to happen.
And finally, reigning unified lightweight champion George Kambosos Jr. stated, "I fought in England, Greece, Malaysia, New Zealand, and 4 times in America to become world champion. I earned my stripes while some of these boys with bigger egos than accolades can't even go to another American state to fight, let alone 8,000 miles down under. How embarrassing." And we know that negotiations between George and Devin Haney, reigning WBC lightweight champion Devin Haney, they have stalled, and it appears that the holdup might be the location of the match. Very recently, Bill Haney, the father of Devin Haney, stated that they want to change the narrative from the fight having to happen in Australia to perhaps happening somewhere else in the world. But George is holding his position that he wants a homecoming fight.
Whether or not you think that makes him unreasonable is up to you.
Though I will say that's the tune he's been singing since he won those belts and turned the boxing world upside down by beating Teofimo Lopez. From the very beginning, he's said he wants a homecoming fight in Australia.
Well, he's being consistent.
He hasn't changed his tune, and I get the sense that perhaps the Devin Haney people aren't too crazy about the fight happening in Australia, or maybe it's the money that fighting in Australia has to offer. Maybe they don't like the money.
Bill mentioned something about Australia being under 50% lockdown.
But I don't know how true that is, because throughout the pandemic, from 2020 till now, cards have been happening in Australia in different parts of the continent. We've seen Tim Tszyu in action at least 3 times since the pandemic started. We've seen Shotgun Shannon O'Connell in action, Taylor Robertson in action. Next month, there's a card going down between Michael Zarafa and Isaac Hardman going down. Sugar Neeks is going to be fighting on that card for the vacant IBF Super Bantamweight title. Essentially, what I'm getting at is when Bill says that Australia is under lockdown,
Paul Galen versus Lucas Brown.
Crossover rugby star turned boxer Paul Galen, he's had 1 or 2 fights since the pandemic started. So I'm not sure what it is Bill Haney is referencing. And to that, George says, but the boy said I'll go to Jupiter. Newsflash, mate. Australian stadiums are open at full capacity. Full international travel starts next month. So bring all your mates. I have not seen one offer with a dollar amount, but you sent the contract. DAZN has no money for you. Ouch!
And you know that Dan Raphael is saying the same thing.
Boxing scribe Dan Raphael, who says that DAZN doesn't seem to be behind Haney versus Kambosos Jr. I don't know how true that is, but maybe that's the holdup. Maybe the dollar amount that the Devin Haney people want to go down to Australia isn't to their liking. George says he hasn't even seen a dollar amount, but supposedly these guys sent him a contract. It's becoming more and more clear what the holdup is, and I maintain my original position. I'd like to see Devin Haney box for those 3 remaining alphabet titles, but if they screw the pooch, they screw the pooch. And there's always been a short window of opportunity to get this fight done because Vasyl Lomachenko wants a shot at those belts as well. And according to Vasyl Lomachenko, they've already made George an offer.
Let's get one thing clear. It's the Matchroom people financing a Haney versus Kambosos fight.
Yeah, George might be the #1 lightweight in the world right now. He might be the unified and lineal champion of that division. But as far as who would be financing a Haney versus Kambosos fight, it would be Matchroom.
That is, I don't know, unless Lou DiBella can get something going with the broadcasters down there in Australia to make Devin an offer.
I don't get the sense that there are any offers coming from the George Kambosos people to the Devin Haney people. I get the sense that what George and Lou and Peter Kahn are waiting for is for Matchroom to name their price. George says he hasn't seen a dollar amount yet. That's what he says. But the situation remains the same. The window of opportunity for Haney versus Kambosos is a limited window, and it could close very soon.
Yeah, people are starting to get upset with George.
And they feel that George is getting to be Mr. Big in the Britches the same way that Teofimo Lopez became Mr. Big in the Britches after the Lomachenko fight. They feel like George is getting a big head. And I'm not sure that I can agree with that we're there yet. Not quite, because George is just holding to what he said immediately after the Teofimo Lopez fight, that he wants a homecoming fight in Australia. He's fought abroad for a good chunk of his career, but now that he's a champion...
Well, now that he's a champion, he wants to fight at home, the way all these American fighters insist on fighting at home.
And I can't really hold that against him, not in good conscience. It's not that outlandish a request, not that outlandish a demand. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Manny Pacquiao went to Australia for a Jeff Horn fight.
But Devin Haney can't go to Australia for Undisputed?
Gennady Golovkin fought Kell Brock in the United Kingdom. He traveled for that fight, so Devin Haney can't travel for the Undisputed Lightweight Championship of the world? I think that's a question that needs to be asked because it's Bill that's expressing some aversion to the fight happening in Australia. You want George's belts? Go get them. This is a bona fide case of he said, she said. Devin Haney himself says he's willing to acquiesce to all of George's demands to make the fight happen and go down there to Australia. But then why is the fight stalled?
If he's willing to give in to all of George's demands, then why isn't the fight done yet?
That's the question.